Thanks for everyone for being here on this very long day and very last symposium of the day, and so quickly after the previous one. I wanted to give some credits for the title to the famous paper by O'Reilly and Mike Frank from 2006. They were the ones who first used this phrase to make working memory work. How can we make working memory work? And I'm going to adapt it to our developmental work. So without any further ado, let's talk about visual working memory in general. What's the common ground? This field is really extensive, literally thousands of papers, including the adult literature, obviously. And what are some of the those features and or attributes that we all agree on? Visual working memory has a limited capacity. That seems to be uncontestable. There's a very intimate link with visual attention, closely related, overlapping, maybe a shared resource. We're going to hear more about that in the rest of the symposium. We also know that the information that's being retained in visual working memory is conceptually organized. Chunking is the term that's been used, and everyone seems to agree on that as well. And there has to be a link with long-term memory, such that information that is first encoded in visual working memory has to be transferred, not necessarily, but typically at some point to long-term memory. So these are some of the basic facts that we all agree on. However, in the past 25 years in the literature, two different varieties or two different interpretations or types of visual working memories have been identified. One of them is that I'm going to call variety number one, is to a mechanism which has a goal to create and maintain a stable visual environment around us. The fact that I look there, I look at Aggie, then I look at Julian, I see that, and I look back and Aggie is still there. I'm not surprised that she's still there. That's the kind of stability that we want an organism to have. And this has been studied with the change detection paradigm very successfully. The original paper that started it all in a way was by Locke and Vogel in 1997. Everyone loved this paradigm because it's super easy. It's you can use it in an fMRI. Literally thousands and thousands of papers have followed up on this work, and it has been adapted for use in infants as well by Lisa Oakes and Locke again. And we know a lot about this type of system. And Locke was the author who called it visual working memory. I'm going to argue that for us, in cognitive developmentalists, while this mechanism is very important, what we're really talking about when we're talking about working memory is really kind of something else. It's a different kind of goal or function, and that is to store and manipulate information in order to solve a task, typically a cognitive task. And we've been studying this ever since Jean Piaget with object hiding tasks. So what I'm going to argue is that first of all, that these two mechanisms are not identical, even though they both are called, literally both called visual working memory, and that I'm going to be focusing on the second variety. What do we know about the development of visual working memory capacity in infants? We've done a lot of work on this way back with Alan Leslie. We found that 6-month-olds can hold on to one object in their memory, but not two. 9-month-olds can do two. And 12-month-olds This is more recent work with Melissa Kibbe and Alan, can hold up to 3 objects, and in a different type of tasks, Lisa Feigenson found the same limit. They also looked at chunking, and lo and behold, with chunking, babies can hold even more than 3 objects. Now, I'm not going to go over this paradigm. It's a classic object hiding paradigm where the two of these bits of data that I was talking about here. I'm going to go on to the open questions. So what I'm going to talk about today is 2 questions. I want to argue that, first of all, given that definition that I gave you of visual working memory, can we actually see that our participants are trying to solve a task, right? We're showing them stimuli. Are they trying to do, are they working on them in the sense that we want them to work in a working memory task or not? And I'm going to do this by presenting you with a paradigm that we developed where we added rewards to the paradigm, and we're measuring their anticipatory looking. In the second part, I'm going to show you some evidence that we actually can see manipulation as well at this age, or in infancy. And that task, I'm going to show you essentially tracking under occlusion, spatial updating using another terminology. So what does this paradigm look like? Some of you may have seen this. This is our published finding. The events go like this. First, babies see 3 cards fly in. Then they see one of the cards exposed. Then the second card is exposed, so you got to see 2 of them. Then they both go face down. So there's a moment when they're all 3 are face down. Then the third one is exposed. That matches one of the previously seen objects. Here, the red star. And what we're testing is during this short period when both of those target cards are still face down, which one is the baby choosing with their eye movements? Which one are they looking at first? And also we're also measuring which one they're looking at longer. These 2 measures are very tightly correlated. The delays in this task are in the range of 2 to 5 seconds, and this is an eye tracking task. Once that response period is over, we present a very brief visual reward to the baby, which acts over trials as a reward, and the 2 cards move next to each other. The match is exposed, so the baby sees the correct response, and the 2 cards move next to each other, and they exit the screen together. I'll show you a little video, a sample of this. Let's see if it works. Does it work? Yeah. So you see it with the eye trace. First card, second card. They go back down. Sample. Ah, there you go. Good job. And that's the reward. They kiss. There has to be some social stuff in it, right? We all know that. Here's a tree, a smiley face. Okay, you've seen that. Now, smiley face. Ah, there you go. All right. I think that was enough. Here are the results. We tested 8 and 10-month-old babies with the same paradigm. 8-month-olds are can't really do this yet above chance, but 10-month-olds can. So what you see there, one on the left side is the measure based on first looks, and the right side is based on longer looks. So 10-month-olds were significantly above chance. In this task, now our next question was, we were hoping that they'd be more motivated because there are rewards and there's anticipation and online processing, but are they really trying to solve the task? How can we get a handle on that? So we try to encourage active engagement. In general, in infant research, we always use all sorts of filters on our data. If the baby is not looking, if the baby is not attending, we know that they're not engaged, right? That's very clear. But what if they are looking? They're still looking, but they're like kind of have these blank stares. We are all familiar with those. And gaze and attention are dissociable. So you can be looking somewhere, but still not attending, and so on. So what we turn to is this easy to obtain physiological measure, pupillometry. You have heard results from Jean-Remy yesterday using pupillometry, so I didn't add a long introduction here, but it's been, this is a measure that's been used for more than 50 years in adult cognitive psychology. First, we discovered that it measures reactions to arousal and emotions, but also cognitive effort or mental effort as well. This was shown as way back in 1964. And research on babies have shown all sorts of really fun effects. For example, when babies see impossible events, you see a larger pupil dilation, or in Jean-Remy's earlier work, when they hear a different consonant in a sequence, their pupil dilates, or even more recently, work with Ernő and his colleagues showing that while they're working out deductive inferences, 12-month-olds have slightly higher pupils, which is really fascinating. So in our next study, we use the same exact paradigm that you've seen, but now with slightly easier objects, familiar objects. We try to boost baby's performance a bit, so a dog and a cat and a ball and a car. Otherwise, everything else was the same, and these were 13-month-old babies. And what you see there is their average group performance, nicely held up. So they're at 59%, but significantly above chance. You see the individual babies' distribution as well, so they can do this task. Now, we looked at the pupil dilation during encoding, and what we found was here we just zoomed into that those 4.5 seconds while the cards were exposed, and when they were folded back down. And what you see here, the green line is the babies. So we split the babies into above and below median performance groups. And the green pupil dilation for the green line is the above median group. And here you see the below median group. And about halfway through this critical period, you see a significant group difference. So what that means is babies who were doing better in this task had slightly, more dilated, more effortful, more dilated pupils overall. And what you see, this is just the same data represented in a different format. There's a significant correlation between pupil change relative to baseline during this encoding period and the baby's performance. And even more interestingly, in my opinion, we found this, it's a slightly weaker effect, but we found it on a trial-by-trial basis as well. So if you pool all the trials together, so not just individual babies are different in this, but at any given moment, if a baby is in a higher effort state, they're more likely to do well in this task. What I'd like to argue, and I'd like you guys to start thinking about pupil dilation in this way, is in essence you can use effort as a filter on our data, just the same way as we use gaze as a filter on our data, to see to capture those moments when babies are actually trying to do something, and not include the variance that comes from all those times when they're not, or they're doing it less. And if we're looking at working memory capacity this way, maybe we find higher capacity values. For example, in this particular sample, if you split the trials by quartiles, the upper pupil quartile, the top quartile performance on those trials was 66%, which is a little bit better than the average. So why does working memory capacity matters? Why do we care whether babies have, how well they can perform in these particular tasks? Well, because all of our cognitive, higher level cognition tasks, in a way, need this, right? You won't be able to do complex relational reasoning, comparisons of bigger and smaller, analogies and so on, unless you can hold on to at least two things, but sometimes even three. So, for example, I've been thinking of various studies, and I just thought of a couple where you need to have at least two representations kept separately in order to solve the task. Sometimes you don't have to hold on to featural information within those representations, but still, these are all studies with 5- and 6-month-olds, and if our working memory literature says, oh, if 6-month-olds can only hold on to one object, then there is clearly a discrepancy there. So one suggestion is that maybe thinking of capacity with this filter can solve this problem. I'll be really fast because I only have 5 minutes. I wanted to show you our manipulation experiment. So it's basically a version of an invisible displacement task a la Piaget, except that we have two objects. And so instead of just tracking where did the one thing go, you have to remember where each one of those things are in a moment while those hiding locations are being moved. So I'm going to quick go through this. The paradigm is exactly the same as before, except that now we show them the two cards, and then they go back face down, and then the cards move. Okay, so we have two movement conditions. One, a very simple translational movement that you see there. So the cards they start up here, and they end up down there. Or we have a more complicated shuffle, we call it a shuffle movement that includes two orthogonal translations. So two cards come in on the side, one goes down while the other one goes to the other side. So it's an L-shaped movement. The final positions of the cards is the same. And we tested 20 and 25-month-old babies and used these abstracts, really hard to name or maybe non-nameable objects, because some of these babies could be potentially using verbal rehearsal. So first, we did our first study was first experiment was just to measure the baseline in 20-month-olds without movement. They can do this, but then when we added movement, it turns out 20-month-olds lose these objects. So they're absolutely at chance. That's what these pairs of bars show, the 20-month-olds, but the 25-month-olds can do this. So both movement conditions. There was a slightly bigger effect size with the translational movement, so that seems to be just following our intuitions. A little bit easier for the 25-month-olds, but they could actually do both of them. I'm going to skip this study. Maybe I come back to it because I'm running out of time. And here are my conclusions. I showed you a new paradigm, prediction-based test of visual working memory for object locations. I showed you that pupillometry can show this interesting insight into this so far not neglected dimension of their performance, which is how much effort they put in, and focusing on higher effort trials or babies who are higher effort in the higher effort state can reveal higher competence, and babies can manipulate information in their visual working memory during the beginning of their second year. In other words, I hope I could convince you that infants have this, what I call variety number 2, visual working memory variety number 2, that involves storing and manipulation of information in service of solving a task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions.
Yeah. Colleen?
So the pupillometry study, I have some comments and questions about that. The first is just to note that there was this beautiful study by John Richards that you may be aware of, looking at heart rate, effortful attention, encoding, and later retrieval. That perfectly aligns with what you found there, but your study is so much more useful than that for people who have trackers, because now you don't need to hook them up to some sort of heart rate machine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really, you know, methodologically, I guess, an advance. I guess I'm just wondering about pupillometry then, and its relation, pupil dilation and its relation to heart rate. So I remember for that study, there's a period of low heart rate during effortful or sustained attention, and then there is actually a spike in heart rate right as they're disengaging, and then you see the disengagement. So is it the case that your blood vessels are dilating and tracking with heart rate, and these are all part of the same phenomena? Like, I don't know enough about how the pupil system is hooked up to the cardiovascular system.
I don't want to pretend that I know a lot either, but what I know about the reason why I think pupillometry, not just because it's an easy to obtain measure, but is more interesting for us at this moment, is because it's in terms of the temporal resolution, it's much more much superior. So you can see changes over on the scale of hundreds of milliseconds, while with heart rate, everything has to be integrated over several seconds. So if you care about are they paying attention during those 2 seconds, you're not going to be able to measure that with heart rate. So that's why I think it's generally it would be it's a more useful measure in many ways. Heart rate and pupils are not that tightly linked, but honestly, at the moment, I wouldn't be able to like map like what would be the heart rate changes expected in this particular paradigm. But I'm a huge fan of John Richards' work, and in terms of its the basic findings and the logic of the study, we're exactly doing the same thing essentially. Yeah.
Further questions, Yuri?
Thank you. Wonderfully thought-provoking talk. So I wonder if you are. There is a distinction. Half of it comes to mind in terms of between phasic
and tonic. Yeah.
And what's the other?
Tonic. Phasic and tonic responses in the pupil.
So what you are showing is phasic.
It's phasic, right? Yes, because it's we do baseline correction. I didn't get into the details, but before the trial, we take a 500 millisecond baseline, and everything is normalized to that. So what you see there as a difference is what materializes at the right from the beginning of the trial. But if your question is about how come that they already differ at the beginning of that, are you going?
Thought of that, yeah.
Yeah. So we thought about that too. Like, oh, why does it? What does that mean? And essentially, the difference, it's not really significant, but it starts to arise. Maybe right after the cards stopped moving, you start to see that those two lines diverging. And it's essentially what that means is that from the baby's perspective, they have to pay attention throughout the whole trial. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know, they don't modulate their attention to that fine level. Like, I'm only paying attention when this happens. So they're in this higher attentive state from as soon as the cards, like when they feel like, it's something is beginning. So that's...
Could you develop this into kind of actually localizing this moment of decision making? When the comparison is made, or the decision is made.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, this is sensitive enough to be able to. I mean, we don't see any of those changes, throughout these periods. But like Jean-Remy's results showed, essentially time locked changes to when the surprise event happens. So yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it's more fun to do it, so you would get an increase in the size of the working memory.
So, I mean, we could go back to violation of expectation type studies where you would see, I would expect that as soon as you take away a screen and it's not what the baby expects. I mean, that's what Jackson and Sierra already showed in one particular paradigm. So that those things should be very tightly time locked to those events. Here, it's more about, there's no surprise here. It's just you just have to predict what's going to happen. And then probably there is a surprise of sorts once the reward is presented, and we do see a big bump there, but it's not at that point. It's not related to performance. Yeah.
As a follow-up on those data,
yeah.
Hello. I'm afraid I don't understand the difference between this quality check, alertness of the children, and the process itself. So why do you think it's not a measure of infants' successful task solving, but rather a general state?
Because when that difference materializes, there is no problem solving yet. So it's there, you're being presented with cards, and if you pay more attention during that period, you're going to do better.
So they are different to begin with.
Yeah, so it's not during the response phase, it's during the encoding phase where we see these differences. Does that make sense? So you have to pay attention when it matters. The only time it matters is when the cards are being exposed. If you
it's the encoding process.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And of course, you also have to maintain some level of effort during the maintenance, right? Because if you lose them, then you're not going to be doing well. But so it's both periods combined, but it's a conditional sense that you have to. If you're not paying attention when the cards are being exposed, then you'll be less successful. Yes. Oh, sorry. No, I'm not picking the. This is fun.
Thank you very much. I love that, the whole talk.
Thank you.
And I particularly like your interest in preparatory responses, possibly associated with encoding mechanisms. But I play the devil's advocate to myself because I love those effects too. One might argue that they may be, as you say, state-based, but not necessarily voluntary or focused on encoding for the purpose of task solving.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether there may be some way in which you can take us back to your point about rewards. Like your trials, I think, are all rewarded, or are there some non-rewarded trials? And would those be able to dissociate between engagement as I'm in a state of engagement and therefore encode better, as opposed to I am really alert now because I want to encode better to solve this problem that is highly rewarding? And I might not do that when it's not that rewarding. Yeah.
So here we always gave them the reward. One of my graduate students was really focused on trying to get the gaze contingent version of this working, and I thought that was a good idea, and we were all gung ho about it. It turned out that when babies don't get rewards, they tune out. So behaviors and comes back and bites us. So we have to know how to train babies properly. And if they don't get the reward, if they make an incorrect choice and don't get the reward, then they just basically within 2 trials they're they stop watching. So we went back to always just having this fixed response time, and there's always a reward. So I don't know. I can't really answer that question. How would we? How well the rewards are working. I was thinking about doing something where we manipulate the reward itself, like make it more rewarding, less rewarding, see if that plays out. But I haven't really found a good parametric way to do that. Yeah. But if anyone has any good ideas, I'd love to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
Thank you
we
so
have no more time for questions, but
Okay.
maybe later. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this lovely conference. I'm very happy to share some of my interests on working memory with my colleagues here. So I'm not going to talk about infants, just a change about this topic. What I'm going to present you today is to give you an overview about the model that we developed with Pierre Barrier, who is sitting in the front row, that you can also ask him tons of questions, and that this way it gives me a bit of rest. Okay, but it's not on my side, so can I change this? It's too, you know, it's a directional mic, and so you have to put it. Thank you. Can you hear me this way? It's better. Yeah, that's it. Thanks. So my aim today is to give you an overview of the model and also to give you some of the idea we developed about sources of working memory development. And if I have time, I hope you keep time. Okay. I will talk about preschoolers and the thing that struggles us about preschoolers. So the previous talk introduced the idea that we have the problem of definition of working memory. And Nelson Cohen recently made an overview of there is broadly 9 definitions of working memory. So I'm going to emphasize, and I agree with you, that the idea is that working memory is a central system, that probably for working memory people is the central system, in which you're going to create mental representation, and that this mental representation is going to help us to understand the world we live in. And also this is where we maintain this representation in face of decay and interference, any sources of loss. But also we're going to manipulate those representations to transform them for our action and to reach the goal we want to reach. So, as it was said just previously, the 2 main functions of working memory can be described as storing this mental representation and manipulate or process this mental representation. So actually, even if relatively late on the day, if I'm asking you to compute 68 multiply 35, I'm sorry, just do it in your native language. It's already difficult. But it's quite obvious that you will have to maintain this information while you start to do the procedural of multiplication, while retrieving some information in your long-term memory to process this. So that means you have to store some information while you process this information. And the main question is, how are we going to be able to do this? In the model that we developed, the time-based resource sharing model, the view we developed, and I'm going not to present the entire model, but just focusing on one particular and central mechanism in the model, is that those 2 activities of working memory, which is processing and storing, are going to rely on a unique, limited resource, which is attention. You can figure out attention as a focus of attention or spotlight of attention. That's going to be easier to follow my talk. So this attention is going to be dedicated to only one cognitive activity at a time. That means it's just like the spotlight. It's going to be either on the storing of the information you store, or it's going to be dedicated to the processing of information. But it's never going to be separated, or you cannot do the 2 things at the same time. So that means that if you want to process some information, your focus of attention is going to dedicate to this processing, but your memory trace that you try to remember are not going to be anymore in this focus of attention, and they're going to fade away a bit out of the darkness, and they start to fall off. So the only way that we manage to simultaneously do some processing while we maintain information, it's to rapidly switch this attention between the 2. So that means we have the feeling that we do things simultaneously, but actually at the 10th of the scale of tenths of millisecond, we only do one thing at a time. So if I'm representing this in a very famous task that we use in working memory, which is the operation span task developed by Randy Engel. If people ask to maintain some letters, so you see on screen a letter, then you have to verify this operation, another letter, another operation, another letter, and this operation. When you do this verification of this one, if we kind of simulate what's going on, is that, for example, you can say, oh, 6 and 7, oh my God, what was the letter? The letter was T, F, B. And so your attention switch back to this letter to reactivate the letter. Then you do a kind of stop in your processing. You keep on going the processing. Oh, I don't know what's 6 and 7. So 6 and 4, I know it's 10. Oh, but the letter was TF, and then 3, and then you know, you move back and forth between the storing and the processing. And at the end, you are able to remember the letter, why you solve this verification of operation by this rapid switching mechanism of your attention. If I go to the more detailed analysis of the task, that means that if you have some M will be memory item and S stimuli to process, when you going to process this stimuli, this is the time your attention is dedicated to this stimuli or this one or that one. While your attention is dedicated to this stimuli, the problem is that you're going to lose your memory item that decay through time. And so the good thing is that you're probably not going to spend all that time to process this stimuli, and when your attention is free again, then you can move back and going to reconstruct or refresh or reactivate, multiple names for saying the same thing. You're going to keep your memory item in memory. And so this mechanism, this idea of switching of your attention between the two processing and storage, lead us to have an operational definition of what is a cognitive load. The cognitive load of a task based on this mechanism will be the proportional time during which processing will occupy attention, and that would, in this case, impair the refreshing and the maintenance of the memory item. A bit like in physics, the power function cognitive load will be the amount of work divided by the total time to do this work. If I'm comparing these two conditions, here you have exactly the same things to do. They're identical, but here the cognitive load of this task will be less because you have more time for doing this work than this one. So that means that our model is going to predict that in this first line condition, in this condition, your performance to maintain the memory item will be better than the second condition. For those who are less familiar with working memory literature, this is a very totally new prediction, actually, because either people will believe that it's the amount of information that distracts your memory is going to impact your memory, and in this case, there's exactly the same amount of distractor in the two conditions, so they will predict no difference, or, which is everyday belief, that memory is depending on the time you maintain information, and in this case, this one, your item, is going to be maintained for longer memory time, and so you should have poorer memory performance here than this one. We predict exactly the reverse. We test this on tons of experiments, but I'm going to just present the simplest task to test this. It's the reading digit span. In this task, it's an adult task, but we're going to talk about children soon. On the screen, you see letters and digit. You have to remember the letters in order, and you just read the digit. That's all. That's the distracting task. And we can manipulate the cognitive load of this distracting task, either, as I just showed you, by increasing the time. If you have exactly the same number of digits, but if you have more time, that reduces the cognitive load, you should be better in memorizing. Or you can increase the number of digits, and in this case, by keeping the time constant, you increase the cognitive load, and then your memory performance is going to decrease. It's it's a lot of work, but it's fairly easy to do, actually. You can just manipulate the time and the number of digits, and in this way, we've been able to define 9 different values of cognitive load. And we predict that the amount of letters that people are going to recall at the end will be fully dependent on this cognitive load. And that's what we observe. That's a pretty nice linear function. And so, as you can see here, it's the amount memory span. So that's the average memory amount of letter that people can recall at the end of a try. And this is the cognitive load, the number of items divided by time. And you have a perfect, quasi-perfect linear function between the amount of memory item that people maintain and the processing. Oh gosh. We did this with another type of task, because this one, it was always the same task, but we can also give other type of task and measuring the cognitive load of those different tasks. It could be updating tasks, inhibition tasks, response selection, retrieval. All these are supposedly based on different processing. But actually, if you measure the cognitive load, they impact simultaneously by grasping attention and give it away from the maintenance. And this is a very clear linear function. But what about children? We're all cognitive developmentalists here in this room. And so the main question is that, are we going to see the same kind of relationship between the amount of memory item and the cognitive load? So using the same reading digit span as I presented you before, we test different age group, 8, 11, and 14. Quite obviously, for anybody in this room, the older children get better performance than the younger one. But what it really interests us is that, first of all, you can see that we replicate this linear function in any of this age group, meaning that from 8 years old to 14, you see this benchmark finding of this mechanism of switching of attention at any age. Just a remark, the 14 years old get the same result as the young adult, which makes an idea about the developmental trend. What is also quite interesting for us is that you can see that the slope are very different compared to the different age. And actually, the 14 years old are more sensitive to manipulation of cognitive load. It's quite paradoxal, because the older are more affected by the increase of cognitive load. Our idea is that because they are more efficient, or they are using more this mechanism of switching of attention, then when you impair this mechanism by making the task more difficult, the cognitive load of the task more difficult, they are suffering more in the maintenance. So this also told us things about what are the sources of working memory development. There's a huge literature about the working memory development and how we can explain this development. But here, from us, you can see that there is some straightforward prediction, is that the older kids are faster to process the information. So that means they will have shorter period of decay because they process this information shorter. And also, they will benefit from longer period of refreshing if you give them the exact same task. So what would happen if we are able to, through the manipulation of the task, compare or control this time parameter? That's what we've done in a series of experiments in which, first of all, the standard task was to establish the difference between two age groups, between 8 years old and 11 years old. They have to maintain letters, and the task was slightly different. They have to add 1 to any digit. So that means they have to say 5, 8, 3, and go on. And the two age groups get exactly the same task. We present the digit for the same duration, and they have, with variable, the time allowed to refresh information, either, no refreshment, 0 milliseconds, or a little bit refreshment, or more refreshment. What we observe is it's replicate previous findings, that first the older kids get better than the younger kids, but also that we replicate this linear function in both age group, and the slope was steeper in the older group than in the younger group. That just replicates previous finding. But then, as I told you, we observed that, and it's no surprise, that the older kids were faster on doing this adding 1 task. So actually, the 11 years old takes 950 milliseconds, while the younger kids take 1,300 milliseconds to do the same task. So it's a kind of a cheating thing, because then they have less decay and they have more time to refresh. That could explain the difference of age. So the fairly first step to do is to equate the processing and give the older kids a task that would last exactly the same amount that the younger. It appears that with these French-speaking kids, when you ask 11 years old to do +2, it's roughly the same amount of time as for the 8 years old to do +1. We had to do a lot of pretesting to find this. So in this case, it's another experiment, a new group. 8 years old do the same task as previously. 11 years old just have to do the +2. And what we observe here, just for sake of comparison, that was the 11 years old of the previous experiment. The 8 years old got the same trend, but you can see that the new group of 11 years old with this task in which we equate the time during which information is going to decay, reduce the difference between the two age groups. But there's still an age difference. Here it is still significant. Where it can come, it's also obvious for us that an 8 years old do everything slower than an 11 years old. I mean, it's obvious for any parents that the 8 years old is slower than 11 years old. So what we did is we did pre-testing to evaluate the difference on these age differences. This is the way you can understand this Bradley plot is that when an 11 years old takes 1,000 milliseconds to do something, then it's roughly 1,500, I mean, you have the equation, so you can compute exactly this difference between the two age groups. And we use this equation to map the time that we're going to give 8 years old to refresh the information. If we are correct, if you give the 8 years old a little bit more time, but not any type of time, the time that map the age differences between 8 and 11, in this case, they should be able to do the same job. So that means they should be able to refresh as good as the 11 years old. So this time, the 11 years old do the +2 task and the 8 years old the +1 task. They map on the processing. And also we give a little bit more time to the 8 years old that is supposed to give them the same ability to refresh the information. And things happen as we were predicted. There is no more any age differences between 8 and 11 years old. And recently, or just to recap, first of all, so you see that if you map, I mean, if you start to control for the time parameter between the two age groups, the age differences between these two, 8 and 11, vanish. And Pierre just recently did the same kind of experiment manipulation with 8 and 15, and again, we had the age difference disappearing. So it's very clear for us that it's very important to pay attention to the time. I just want to a last experiment on preschoolers. Is it possible that there is one age in which this mechanism of refreshing, so that ability to reactivate, to flexibly manipulate attention, to store and process information will not be working or not be here? We test 5 years old and 7 years old in another type of task. As it was mentioned previously, I mean, if you change, we discussed it at a poster session, I forgot. So if we start to work with younger kids, you have to change a little bit the material. So this time they have to maintain animal name, presenting it with pictures of animal, and the task was to name the color of smileys. And they don't kiss to each other in those tasks like yours. And we manipulate the pace of the cognitive load of the task. Either the condition, in one condition there was only one color in 2,000 milliseconds, or two color in 2,000 milliseconds, or two color in 4,000 milliseconds. So that means you have two conditions, one color in 2,000, two color in 4, which is exactly the same cognitive load. For us, we should have no difference in the memory, but two color in 2000 is a higher cognitive load, and so performance should be lower. But also, you can see that two conditions last the same. In fact, if there is an age in which children are not using this mechanism of reactivating through the attention, the memory item, what is going to predict their performance? it is just a time lag. So they go into encode the information, they do nothing with it, and so it starts to fade away and fade away and fade away. And if you wait too long, then it will totally disappear. So we predict that if children are not using any refreshing, they will totally be affected by the time. And if you have a longer duration, they're going to have poorer performance. In 7 years old, we replicate the cognitive load effect. So that means the two conditions with the same cognitive load get the same high performance, and with a higher cognitive load, you have a decrement of performance. But for the 5 years old, the pattern of results are totally different. I mean, obviously, the 5 years old get poorer performance, but we already know that. But what is really intriguing here is that at 5 years old, they are they are affecting by the duration of the task. So when the task lasts 2,000, there's no different. Whatever they have 1 or 2 information to process, which is quite intriguing for other models of memory. But when you increase the duration, there's a drop. So at that age, we believe that they're not using, or they're not actively using, this mechanism of refreshing. I was going to, if I have 1 more minute, maybe, okay, sorry. We develop, so it's very intriguing for me to work on preschoolers, which is a bit outside my zone of confidence, but really nice to see what we can do to understand preschoolers. And we try to develop a task which is a little bit more game-like, like playing with grocery shop. It's a shopping task in which kids have to pick up fruit. So we show them series of fruit and they have to pick up the fruit. Makes things more engaging. And we manipulate the attentional demand of the distracting task, not by asking something too difficult, because they were 3, 4 years old. They either have nothing to do, so they just wait, no cognitive load, and we pretend that the shop is not open to make sense of it, or we ask them just to walk straight to the shop. And we know that at that age, there is already an attentional demand of walking. Or we can increase the attentional demand by making the path more difficult, and they have to jump on some path on the way. It's also very game-like things. But on all these conditions, the goal is always to remember the shopping, which is also nice because we have no issue about maintenance of goal, because otherwise you cannot play to do the shopping if you don't remember the list. What we observe at 4, 5, and 6, first, we have no interaction with age, which is questioning. But we show that first, if you look at a low-demanding compared to a high-demanding task, there is already a decrement. So in the previous experiment that I told you, we didn't find any impact of the attentional demand. But in this kind of context, in which is an engaging task, there is an attentional demand effect that we did not observe before. And that's the kind of thing we try to understand right now, what we can do to try to, when the preschoolers are using or not using attention to maintain information. So if I'm going to skip this. My take-home message for today is that time is an important constraint of working memory functioning. And I think to cognitive developmentalists, it's clear that the dynamic of the functioning of cognitive development and on working memory is extremely important. So this time-based phenomena and the sharing of attention in a time-based manner should be extremely carefully looked at. I went extremely fast on doing all this. If you want to know more about the work, we summarize all of work in this book. And recently, a couple of months ago, we also summarized the work on the development of working memories, how working memory develop, but also from Piaget to nowadays, the role of working memory. And we have also another book. It's going to appear next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Time for questions or comments.
I'm going to do a bit of that. Is anyone fancy to do in infant, those kind of things? I'm happy to collaborate. Because I don't have the skill for doing this.
I think, is it me? Okay.
Is there a question somewhere?
Yeah. Thank you for the fascinating talk. Very jealous that you made an equation and then got data to fit the equation. That's very cool. The question I had was, did you look at all at how the preschoolers were behaving in the secondary tasks? So do you see any evidence that the older children might be showing any decrement in their walking performance when they are rehearsing the material, or that doesn't change?
I mean, in this task, you know, the behavior is literally. There's no change. So there was no change between the 4, the 5, and the 6 years old, and we did. I mean, it's my obese task currently. So we did lots of this, and we have no change during this age, which is quite intriguing, in fact. But we have no change.
Further questions? I had a question.
Please.
It was not clear to me whether in this task you only had. Did you also have a time manipulation? No. So it was not as in the previous task a time-dependent cognitive load. So this was a simple.
Thank you for the question, because I mean, I really like these kind of things, but it was not clearly explained because I was short in time. Actually, it was exactly the same duration. So what we did is that we pre-test and control. So the kids show this little shop, and we changed the distance of the shop. So that means it was always either they wait in the front of the shop, and I think it was 3 seconds. I'm not very sure, I forgot all the detail, but 3 seconds. Or they have to walk straight, and so we control for each kids the distance. They walk on this duration, and we put the shop at that exact distance. And when the walk is more difficult, we had to shorten the distance, but the time was controlled.
And is there a reason why you did not use different?
It was already, it was already. I mean, you all work with kids, so you understand fairly. I mean, those who work with adults, it's more difficult for them to understand that. It's very long for kids to do because it's a within subject experiment. So they have 3 conditions with several try each time. And so it was so long already with one duration that was not possible. And also for the older kids, the room were not big enough for the kids to walk. So because we do these things, with school, and so that's why we did not manipulate. But we had different experiments in which we had different duration, but it's always around this 2 seconds, 3, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and there's no change. What intrigued me the most here is that really depending on the context, at that age, you see or not an impact of the cognitive, of the attentional demand of the task. And that's quite intriguing, I think. And we spent the 4 last year trying to understand and still not resolve it. Keep us busy.
Questions?
Oh, there's someone here.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about the refreshing mechanism?
Yeah.
So, do you think that is a mechanism itself, or is that is that a procedure, perhaps? You talked about going from maybe semantic recall and some kind of process that you recall and sequentially working through a task. Is that a process itself that has to be learned, or is it? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. So far, there's a huge debate about what is attentional refreshing, and there is different definition currently. What we believe currently is that is not a procedure, is really something like, it's automatic. You know, I pretend when I was explaining this operation span that, oops, I forgot the letter, but there's no oops in your head. Your attention switch back and forth between the processing and the maintenance. And actually you cannot even try to, I forgot the English word, not to instruct, you can instruct people to do this, and it seems that they have totally different pattern of result. If you ask people, oh, you know, don't rehearse verbally, but now refresh, and you think, nobody's going to understand, what does that mean? Oh, now refresh. And actually, it changed the pattern of result of people. For example, it makes disappearing the phonological similarity effect, if you ask people to do a refreshing instead of rehearsal. It makes the word length effect disappearing if you ask them to refresh instead of rehearsal. So there is something that's qualitatively different on that. It's also rely on attention, while rehearsal does not rely on attention. Verbal rehearsal, you know, the voice in your head that talks to you. So even if you're not schizophrenic, you know, it's quite normal. So we think that it's something that automatically occurs, but probably not at any age, and obviously the results say not at the same efficiency. Some colleague of us in Zurich, they try with a paradigm to implement refreshing, and also try with cueing things, but it's not working. So it's not metacognitive in the sense that you can talk to yourself, oh, now I need to refresh. You know, it's not working. If you do this, or if you do a paradigm in which people are accused they can use to refresh, they start to mess up totally, because there's so much in the control of the task that that's triple tasking, kind of. Yeah. But it's true that it's no clear. There is some idea. There is some study in which what kind of area in the brain is involved when you actively refresh information, but that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't typically think of my work as being visual working memory. I don't talk about it in that way, but it's easy to think about it in that way, because what I'm going to be talking about today is the kinds of information that babies include in their object representations as objects are moving in and out of view, their visual working memory, and the kinds of experiences that can alter the types of information that babies attend to. So to give a little bit of background, I need to first define what object individuation is. Many of you probably already know, but I just want to clarify. Object individuation is the ability to keep track of the numerical identity of an object even when perceptual contact is lost. So even when there are discontinuities in space and time. It's not the ability to recognize whether something looks the same or different. It's the ability to recognize that it's a numerically distinct object. So we've been studying object individuation for many years now. We've used a number of methods, a violation of expectation methods, eye tracking methods, action tasks, and now functional near-infrared spectroscopy. What I'm going to focus on today is are the kinds of experiences that can alter the type of information that babies pay attention to. So what I'm going to do is first just give you an example of a behavioral task that we use, because this is the task that is used in many of the experiments I'll talk about today. So for example, in a violation of expectation paradigm, a baby will see an event, for example, in which there's a color change. So there is a red ball will go behind one side of a screen, a green ball come out on the other side, and then the screen will rotate down. If babies perceive that or interpret that event as involving two distinct objects, so they use the difference in color to individuate the objects, and they should expect to see two objects and be surprised when there's only one. So we can compare it. There's a number of different control conditions, but a typical control condition is showing an event in which babies see a green ball. So if they have perceived the color change event as involving two, they should look reliably longer at the final phase of the event than babies who see a control event. If they haven't used the featural differences to individuate the objects, they should look equally at those two events. We can take this into an eye tracking paradigm, which we have done. And now what we do is we measure the percentage of time that babies visually search the center of the screen in number 5 on the slide. So if babies expect there to be a second object behind the screen, they should spend a greater percentage of time searching behind the area behind the lower screen than if they didn't expect the second object. So those are 2 of our behavioral tasks. We have a number of other ones, but I'm not going to go through all the kinds of tasks that we use. So we have shown babies a variety of events in which we manipulate just one feature at a time. So in our initial studies, we had objects that varied on many different features. And then we began to study what particular features are babies most sensitive to. So for example, we can show babies a shape difference event, a color difference event, a control event. We can show babies events in which the pattern changes or the luminance changes, the brightness changes. And what we found over the last many years now is that, at least in our task, that we have found a developmental hierarchy in the type of information to which babies are most sensitive. So early in the first year, by about 4.5 months, babies are very sensitive to form features. So differences in shape and size, babies will individuate by differences in shape and size. However, it's not until the end of the first year that babies will use surface differences. So for example, if the objects vary on their color or in their luminance, babies don't interpret that event as involving 2 distinct objects until the end of the first year. Now this was a bit of a puzzle, because we know babies can, prior to the end of the first year, can perceive luminance differences and color differences. So how do we explain this developmental hierarchy? One way to explain it is that it's due in part to visual maturation. So early in the first year, babies don't get good information about color because of the immature visual system, yet from an early age they're getting good information about form features because of sensitivity to areas of high contrast, because of sensitivity to motion carried information. But that can't be the whole story, because babies by 4.5 months have pretty good color vision and they're categorizing by color. So it can't just be a visual maturation hypothesis. That can't be the explanation. So what we have proposed is that this is related to information processing biases. So form features, so babies who have a limited information processing capacity are going to tend to, in physical events, within the context of physical events, are going to attend to those features that are intimately tied to objects that are stable, that are predictive. They're going to be less likely to attend to surface features because these are modality specific, whereas form features are amodal. They're arbitrary and they're relatively unstable. So for example, the color of an object can look different depending on lighting conditions. So the way to test this hypothesis, we've done it in a number of ways. One way that we've done it is multisensory priming. So the idea is that we could perhaps lead babies to attend to color differences or other surface features if we gave them information that led them to perceive color differences as stable and as predictive. One priming mechanism that we've done is multisensory priming, and that's linking color to objects through multisensory exploration. I'm not going to talk about that at all today. I just wanted you to know that we have 2 different mechanisms or way that we've primed babies to attend to color information. What I am going to talk about today is color function priming, and that's making color predictive by pairing color with object function. And so what we did in these events is prior to the individuation task, so in all the tasks I'm going to show you today, almost all of them, the study ends, or the experimental session ends with an individuation task. What we vary is what we do prior to the individuation task. So in one of our first color function priming studies that we did with 9.5-month-olds, we showed babies pairs of events. We showed babies pound events in which a green can pounded a nail, followed by a pour event in which a red can scooped and poured salt. So these cans, these objects with handles, are exactly the same in their form. The only thing that differs is their color and the function in which they engage. So you may be asking right now, well, so why did you start with function? Like, what's so special about function? Well, we know that babies are sensitive to the functional properties of objects very early in development. So within the first 6 months, they're manipulating objects. They recognize the relation between object surfaces and their properties and their function. By the end of the first year and beginning of the second year, they're categorizing based on function. And there was also some evidence at the time that babies, when they're in the process of building functionally relevant categories, when they're developing functionally relevant categories, that can sometimes lead babies to attend to other kinds of information, other perceptual characteristics that aren't necessarily function related, but just the engaging in that categorization process can alter the kinds of information that babies attend to. So what we did is we showed these 9.5-month-old pound-pour events, and we had 2 pairs of objects. So they saw 2 pairs of pound-pour events with pair 1 and then with pair 2. And so these objects are seen, these events are seen successively. What we found is that we were able to prime the 9.5-month-old babies to attend to color information. So when you show them the priming events and then you give them an object individuation task, 9.5-month-olds who don't typically use color and are tasked to individuate objects now individuate by color. We did a number of follow-up studies, and we found that, first of all, it's specific to object function. So if we do exactly the same event, but rather than having the objects engage in a function, they just moved up and down next to the nail, or made a scooping and pouring motion, but did not engage in a function, that did not lead to priming, the priming of color. So it's specific to object function. It generalizes to other object functions. So we also did stir-lift events. So a spoon that stirred versus a spoon that lifted something. We found that unique exemplars are required. So if you show babies 2 pairs of pound-pour events, 9.5-month-olds, with 2 different pairs, you get color priming. If you show them 2 pairs with the 2 pairs of events with the same exemplar pair, you don't get color priming. So it requires a number of unique exemplars to get priming. Number of exemplars required, 9.5-month-olds succeed or individuate by color. With 2 exemplars, younger babies, 7.5-month-olds, need 3 exemplars. Even younger babies not only need to see the exemplars, but they have to have they have to be able to compare the exemplars side by side. So you have to have the pound and the pour there, right? So they need to have those exemplars side by side. So there are developmental changes in sensitivity to building these categories, and it's priming for specific color. So if you show babies priming events that involve red and green, they will not individuate by yellow and blue. They'll only individuate by yellow and green. We've also conducted some near studies using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, looking at the cortical basis of object individuation and priming. And what we find in our studies is that so here we have a picture of a baby's head. The sources are in red, the squares are detectors, and our channels are numbers. And what I'm going to do is just circle on here the areas that I'm looking at, and below that you'll see the hemodynamic curves. So in all of our events, color change, control, shape change, we get activation in occipital cortex to all of our events. Not surprising, right? That should not be specific. What we hypothesized is that we would be more likely to get activation in the higher temporal areas, higher level temporal areas to object individuation than not to object individuation. Here in the posterior part of the temporal cortex, we got activation to almost all of our events, although this is age related. We're more likely to get it in younger babies than older babies. But the most important thing is that babies, for example, who are 4.5 months, these are babies who are between 4.5 and 6.5 months, you can see in anterior temporal cortex, we get activation to events in which babies individuate, shape, but not in which babies don't individuate, color. But you know what? If we prime babies, We show them the color function events prior to the individuation task. We get individuation, and then we get activation in the anterior temporal cortex. So we suggest that we have identified this cortical signature of object individuation. There's a lot of questions about really what that signature means, but it's an intriguing finding. Okay, so now I just want to recap up to now, like this is the basic phenomenon. So I want to recap what I've talked about so far. Babies form color function categories. What's really intriguing about this is that it suggests that babies are kind of working very hard to make sense of their world, and they're linking together, they're linking information to which they might typically not be sensitive to information to which they find very salient, but not all associations or regularities are salient. So it's not just paired association. You can't pair color with anything. It needs to be something to which babies are already sensitive. This will increase sensitivity to color, and priming leads to changes to brain and behavior. Now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit because I'm going to focus a little bit more conceptually on what's going on in these priming tasks. So one of the questions that we asked is that, so our hypothesis or our thinking is that there's something special about function, and function requires an agent, and it requires there's a causal structure to it. And we wondered, does agent really matter? So for example, there's some data that suggests that infants are more likely to expect human hands than mechanical hands to act in goal-directed intentional ways. So Amanda Woodward had a seminal study in 1998, and there's been a number of studies since then that suggest that babies are more sensitive or expect human versus mechanical hands to act in intentional goal-directed ways. So what we did is we repeated these experiments, but we had two different kinds of hands. We had a human hand and we had a mechanical hand. I'm going to try to make this, if I can. I just have to get my, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, just imagine, let me try one more time and then I'm going to just move on. I can't see where my cursor is. Can you see oh, yes, so I'm like going crazy up there, and you all are wondering, what is she doing? Okay, I have to look up here. Okay, so here's a pound event. Oh, see, now I have to go backwards. Okay, yeah. I'm going to watch up here. Why does it not want to do that? I was going to show you my pound and pour event. Oh. It doesn't want to do it. Okay, you can see the hand do the pour event. That was the pour event. So we did, these were babies between 6.5 and 9.5 months of age. We showed them pound events, we showed them pour events, and then we also showed them a similar event, except that we replaced the hand with a black glove with a grabber, one of those things you can buy at the store to reach off of shelves, and put a black glove on that. And again, we did 3 pairs of events, and then we showed babies the control or a change color event. And what we found is that babies who saw the human hand pound pour event look reliably longer during the final phase of the color change than control. Babies who saw the mechanical hand event did not. So the babies who saw the mechanical hand were not primed to attend to color. The babies who saw the human hand were. So our next question was, to what extent do these early emergent distinctions reflect organizing principles of the human cortex? So the idea is that there may be something special about human hands and mechanical hands, and if there is something special about them, perhaps the human cortex is organized to perceive them and process them in a different way. So what we did is a near study where we showed babies one of 4 hand type, one of 4 conditions. We crossed human hand type, human or mechanical, but by event type, function or non-function. So non-function is a motion event where the objects, the containers undergo motion, but there's no function involved. The red X is the condition in which you get priming. You don't get priming in any of the other conditions. What we found, here's babies, here's putting a headgear on a baby. And there's a baby participating. We had 4 sources and 4 detectors on each side of the head. So what that means is that we had 10 channels from which we measured. And we measured from the anterior part of the temporal cortex to the posterior part of the temporal cortex. If you look at adult data, fMRI data, you would predict that perhaps you would get more activation to human than mechanical entities in the right hemisphere, especially in the superior temporal cortex, or superior temporal sulcus, superior temporal gyrus, and more activation in left hemisphere to mechanical objects, and more in the medial temporal sulcus gyrus area. What we found in these babies is that, first of all, we didn't see lateralization like you see in adults. In the right hemisphere, what you see here are the numbers are the channels from which we measured. The numbers that are circled are the areas, the regions of interest, the channels that hung together, the regions of interest in which we got activation. So we found in the right hemisphere overall greater activation to human than mechanical hands. It didn't matter what event they were engaging in, got greater activation to human than mechanical hands. But what we found in the left hemisphere is greater activation to human than mechanical hands, but only to the function event. So there is functional specialization early in the first year or mid in the first year, not only to human versus mechanical hands, but human hands that are gauging in functionally relevant events. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some more recent study. Well, those were recent studies, but here's some other recent studies that we haven't published yet. One of our questions that we've always had from the beginning is that, can we get priming across knowledge systems? So all of the work that I've been doing, talking about object individuation, it's about the physical reasoning system, the object tracking system. There's some data to suggest, and many people have argued, and a number of people have written about, the possibility that the human brain is organized to process and understand physical events or physical interactions differently than social interaction, social reasoning. So there's a lot of data that suggests babies have different expectations for the way that physical objects move and interact than social objects interact. So our prediction was that we can prime babies perhaps to attend to color information within the context of physical reasoning, but we probably couldn't do it within the context of social reasoning. So what we did is we did some priming tasks. We're switching now. We're not using objects in function, but we had objects that underwent mechanical interactions. So we have a little hill here. We have a red inanimate, well, we have a red object. Those are not eyes on the red object. They're just black things on the red object. And then we're going to have an object, a purple object, that's going to it's going to pull that object up the hill, or we're going to have a yellow object that's going to, well, actually in this one, the purple one is pulling up the hill, the yellow one is pushing down the hill. And we counterbalanced whether yellow or purple pushed or pulled. We also counterbalanced whether the pull or the push was up or down the hill. So some of you are looking at this and saying, you know, that looks like vaguely familiar to me. Like, what's the hill and the thing going up and down the hill? It looks familiar to you because this is Karen Wynn and Hamlin Wynn and Bloom study where they did social evaluations. So they had helpers. So they had a little helper that it can either, there's an object, the red, the agent or the patient that comes in and wants to get up the hill, and then you have a yellow thing, another actor that comes in and either pushes it up the hill, or you have a purple thing that pushes it down the hill. So you have a helper and a hinder. So in one case, these events share similar perceptual characteristics. So what we did is we took these eyes and we put them, made them not eyes and made them black things on a physical object. We took the little hair and put it on the side so that it could hook on, and it can either push or it can pull. We also had control experiments where the social event, where the events are exactly the same, but the objects never came in contact. So we had in the social event, the patient came in and jumped up and down, and another object went up or down the hill with them without ever coming in contact. Or in the physical event, the object came in and another object went up or down the hill with it, but they never came in contact. So there's no interaction. So it's social and mechanical events, and it's also whether there is interaction or not interaction. We had test events. This time it's with yellow and purple because that's the color that we were priming. What we found is that you get priming to the mechanical. So we have a 2 by 2 again. The entity is mechanical versus social, and the event is interaction versus non-interaction. You only get priming in the mechanical interaction event. You don't get priming when there's not an interaction, and you don't get priming when it's a social event. I also want to say that at the end of each of these experiments, we gave babies a choice. Do you want the helper or the hinder, or do you want the pusher or the puller? And we've replicated, as many people have done, the Hamlin and Wynn studies, where babies will choose the helper over the hinder. You give them a choice between a pusher and a puller, and there is no choice. I mean, their babies choose those, they choose them equally. If there's no interaction, babies also don't choose, or they choose equally the two objects. Then finally, what we have looked at, so then our next study is a near study looking at, once again, to what extent do these early emerging distinctions reflect organizing principles. So we used the same array, the same optical array as we used in the previous experience. Now we have social versus mechanical interactions, and we did the study where we had the interactions and then the social mechanical events without the interaction. What you see up here is what we've got in the function studies. I just wanted to remind you of the areas of the cortex in which we get activation when we do function events. When we do social and mechanical events, what we find is that in the left hemisphere, we get activation into the social interaction event, but not the mechanical interaction event, and it's a little bit more anterior in the temporal cortex. In the right hemisphere, we get activation to both. So we've done some follow-up studies with slightly older babies, and when we test slightly older babies, actually these are babies between like 10 and 15 months of age, then we began to get right hemisphere activation to social events that's lateralized. So that seems to be a shift in lateralization during the first year. So what have we learned? So I've covered I know I've covered a lot of territory, but I think what these studies have been telling us is they've given us insight into object representation. How do babies represent objects? What kind of information do they use to keep track of objects as they move in and out of view? And we can think about that in terms of working memory. It's also so intriguing that these events, that you can change the kind of information to which babies attend to by giving them events in which they can link information that's consistent with another source of information to which they're already sensitive. And that can change the kinds of information they pay attention to in a completely different event. So there's this transfer of sensitivity color from one event to the other. And then our more recent near studies looking at these different types of objects, types of interactions, types of agents, has given us some insight into the organization of early knowledge. And so I think it's time for me to stop there. I just want to thank all of my collaborators and the parents and the kids and the funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time for a couple of questions.
Thank you. So I was wondering that you're suggesting that they individuate objects based on color if they see two different functions. But I'm wondering, how do we know that they're not individuating based on a function alone? So if you showed them a hammering event and a pouring event, but both green, maybe they would also expect two objects because one object can only have one function.
They see, in the priming events, they see the containers pounding and pouring, but in the test events, it's the objects. So the objects themselves have not undergone function. So in order to be sensitive to that color information, they, what we have argued is they had to build an event representation and linked that color difference to a function difference, and that heightened their sensitivity to color, which then carried forward into the test trials. Does that make sense?
I see. They seemed a bit similar in the pictures, but I see.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, could you elaborate if you have any personal intuition as to why infants failed to individuate agents who were in a meaningful interaction?
Agents in a meaningful...
In the helping, hindering case.
We did not test whether they individuated those objects or not. So what we tested, I can see I didn't do a very good job here. So we didn't test whether they individuated the agents. What we did is show them events in which we link color to agents and their actions.
Oh, it's a priming, okay.
Then tested their ability to individuate a different set of objects that were not agents. But that's a good question, and that's a different area of study that I'm sure other people here can address.
Hi, thank you very much. So for us, of course, it's surprising that function presentation would prime attention to color, because we know that color doesn't play a role, right? But for infants, it doesn't have to be the case. I mean, they don't know what, they may not know what plays the causal role in these functional events or not. So do you know if there's a way to invalidate color in this context? So for instance, if it's obvious that the color is superficially sort of induced feature, rather than internal feature of the object. Yeah. So
there are some data, I think it was data from Amy Booth, and so Amy Booth had some data that suggested that when at least older infants are forming categories, that are functionally relevant categories, they will begin to attend to other perceptual characteristics that are not relevant at all. So I don't think it matters whether babies perceive. I don't think babies perceive color as relevant. I don't think they perceive color as necessarily relevant. What they're perceiving is a category in which color is linked to function. But color doesn't have any real meaning in terms of predicting the outcome of physical events. Color typically doesn't predict the outcome of physical events, but you have to give them experiences to lead them to believe it's predictive, or lead them to believe it's predictive in order to increase that sensitivity.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are a bit short of time, so thank you again.
I'll start with a disclaimer. I am most definitely not a working memory researcher. So when I received the invitation for the talk, I was very surprised, and neither am I an infant researcher. So I'm going to do my level best to highlight right now, and in fact show you if it works. No, no, see, maybe it will work. Here is my spotlight, attention. And throughout my talk, when I use the term memory, I'm going to be referring to memory systems. And in fact, on purpose, I'm very interested in potential similarities in how attention operates in the context of short-term memory, working memory, in interactions with long-term memory, and try and draw some of the commonalities as well as some of the really interesting differences. Okay, so if you were expecting a working memory talk, this is not it. However, what I want to hope convince you of is that there is much to be learned from the classical work of working memory researchers. In fact, you've heard them speak just now, Zsuzsa and Valerie, and also from work on knowledge and systems of knowledge, as we've heard Teresa speak. there's much to be learned from that work in terms of understanding how attention comes to be as attentive as it is in adults. So I have multiple favorite models of attention, and some have neural implementations to them, some do not have them. I don't want to highlight a particular favorite here. So here they are all very quickly, but I want to highlight some of their similarities. All of these attention models, of adult attention at least, are characterized by varieties of attention. And so, in fact, I won't have enough time to talk extensively about how I think we should really think about attention as differentiable. Attention over time, attention over space, attention when things get difficult. I'm going to use the term attentional orienting, attentional control and guidance, even if it hides some really interesting varieties of attention. That's one commonality of those models. But the second commonality, which is perhaps most relevant to this question of interactions with memory, is that all of those models assume attention as a gateway, as a bottleneck. In fact, we've heard that term being used as a limiting factor to what then enters into further memory and learning. But interestingly, many classic attention researchers, like my gods and heroes, have recently, like Sabine Kastner, Kia Nobre, Marvin Chun, not that recently, but I have very much been intrigued by how even in adults, thinking of attention as a bottleneck doesn't quite work. How, in fact, we can learn a lot by thinking about bidirectional relationships between attentional guidance and memory systems. And this is even when we think about adults who have a very efficient attentional guidance system and pretty well-established memories. But, and this is where I bring in my friend Dima, Dima and I, both developmentalists, were doubly intrigued by this move in the attentional literature, because we thought that if you now put a developmental timeline to this question of interactions between attention, attentional guidance, their development, its development, and memory systems and their developments, then it becomes really intriguing to ask what are the mechanisms by which attentional guidance influences memory? And beautiful work by Valerie definitely highlights that point. And also, and if I have time, I will talk about this other aspect of the more recent work we've been doing, how the influence of growing or changing memory systems might influence attentional guidance as well. So the other way around as well. So hopefully we'll get through the first part, and then if time allows, also the second part. We tend to use a variety of methods with collaborators. My collaborators and I, I'm lucky to work with people who work with many methodologies. Today I will primarily focus on behavioral data, but actually please do ask about EEG and eye tracking data because I love them. So later on, hopefully they'll come up. And MEG as well. There you go. And I'll take you through what I think we can learn about attention mechanisms by studying their interactions with memory systems. First, influences of attention on memory. Then, if we have time, influence on attention from memory. And then back to attention models. And this is my take-home message. I'm going to spoil the fun. I have, as an attention researcher, I think learnt that how we become attentive observers as adults and as older and efficient children who attend really well, in terms of our interactions with memories as they get established, is really, really important and interesting. And then there are many open questions, of course. So, first part is going to focus on attention influences on memory, and is going to draw very much on the work of some great collaborators I've had the pleasure to work with, Andrea and Duncan, who, like me, started off as attention researchers and therefore started with very simple memory paradigms. And the one that we thought would allow us to test attention benefits in the context of memory was an adaptation of a very simple short-term memory paradigm in which you see a number of items, then they go away, and then you're asked, was the probe item part of the memory array? And if you paid attention, you'd know that yes, it was. And this is a very simple short-term memory paradigm. I should not be using the term working in this context at all. There is no additional processing. And yet, we know from work with adults that adults really benefit in their memory of that probe item if they receive a cue that primes them to attend spatially to one of the items in the array, what we call a pre-cue. But equally and very interestingly, in very similar ways, they also benefit, there you go, if they receive an equivalent spatial cue, but during their maintenance period, so while the information is not available anymore. So encoding and maintenance benefit from these very simple spatial cues. We know from work by Kia Nobre and other colleagues, and Lame and colleagues. And Andrea was very interested in trying to understand whether these same kinds of effects operate in younger individuals to the same degree of efficiency. And in fact, with classical attention manipulations, does it matter if the cues are centrally presented or peripherally presented? Does it matter what the nature of the cue themselves are? And so she manipulated those. But she was also very interested in mapping the temporal dynamics of those orienting effects. And again, that's a classic attention question that we addressed with EEG and MEG. I won't talk about the EEG and MEG data, but do ask about them if you're interested in them. Behaviorally, what Andrea found was that, well, first of all, when testing 7-year-olds, 11-year-olds, and adults, that 7-year-olds are not very good at remembering 4 items. But that if you quantify the benefit that these groups of individuals draw from attention cues, actually when those attention cues happen prior to encoding, in preparation for items that are going to then be encoded into memory, 7-year-olds are pretty good and just as good as all the children and adults in drawing attentional benefits in favor of their memory. What they're not as good at is drawing benefits from cues that orient their attention during their maintenance period. And that was an initial finding that then Andrea replicated multiple times, and that she became very intrigued in understanding better. There were other effects that we were also really interested in, but they are attention geeky kind of effects. For example, that the nature of the physical attention cues doesn't matter, that in fact these benefits are present for all, but only if the cues are informative. So probably these attention effects are not simply reflexive, they're more voluntary. We can return to those questions again. What then she became really, really interested in understanding better were the factors that influence these maintenance differences between children and adults. And she investigated them across all of her PhD studies. So I'm going to take you through what ended up being the one set of studies that try to consolidate a lot of work by her and many other colleagues in this area into one set of systematic manipulations. What she did was manipulate the time available for the decay of information, and you've heard from Valerie that time-based decay is a key element in understanding maintenance, even simple short-term memory maintenance. So she manipulated the duration that intercurred between the presentation of the array and the presentation of the probe. But then also was very interested in attentional benefits that were available, just like she'd studied them before. And so she manipulated, interestingly, the presentation of the cue, the time window between the onset of the stimuli encoding into memory and then the refreshing attentional cue, spatial attentional cue. Now, I think in the end, Andrea has to be lauded for the interest in really beautiful comparisons that then can be made across conditions. And I hope to be able to do justice to that point, the point that her cues across conditions, maybe this doesn't work so well, her cues across conditions appeared at the time when in other trials, in other condition types, a probe had appeared. So she was very interested in understanding if, in effect, cues could rescue into memory representations that by that point may well have decayed. That's great, thank you. And not only that, but she was also interested in another classic manipulation that working memory researchers have told us a lot about, the effects of load. How much information do you have to remember and maintain in memory? And so she manipulated load as well. What she found in children, but in fact in adults as well, was that the time characteristics of the presentation of the probe, the items and the probe, arrays and probe, was key. So you see even in white that when there are no cues, when you're simply presented with 4 items and then ask the probe question, your memory decays relatively quickly across those 3 intervals. But also, and very interesting, cues that are spatial in nature seem to rescue those memory representations. So if you look at Cowan's, at capacity index, memory capacity index, at the longer interval, what we call the visual short-term memory interval, under the cued condition, memory is at a level that is equivalent to what it was when those probes were presented much earlier. Right? So interestingly, these cues rescue representations. And there's a lot of debate, in fact, on whether that's rescue or something else. And we can go back to that point. Load also has a huge effect on one's ability to remember. And interestingly, as you'd expect, then both children and adults are better able to remember fewer items than more items. But the action from attentional cues, where attention really matters, is at the limits or beyond the limits of attentional capacity. So it's when we're working with 6 items that, for example, adults don't really need much attention, refreshing really, with 3 items, where they draw the biggest benefits. So that's really interesting, and it was, at least in the context of Andrea's PhD, a way of bringing together multiple factors that had been studied and have been studied, except for the work that Valerie just talked about, in the context of working at attention and time-based accounts, have tended to be studied separately. So she was really interested in bringing them together in an attempt at a model, a descriptive model, that applies to visual-spatial short-term memory maintenance. We discussed in that long paper that I recommend, however, because it tries to think about these multifactorial aspects, how when visual sensory input comes in, multiple influences moderate how well we maintain that information in memory. Even at the level of very short-term memory maintenance, what's called the iconic store, there may well very basic sustained attentional mechanisms that can help maintaining that information, and we can talk about that. And decay and effects of load even within that context. But effects of familiarity, of the nature of the stimuli that we'll return to in a moment, even at this short-term window of time. And then we move into shorter memory realm, then again, both load and familiarity in Andrea's many experiments seem to have an effect on the ability to maintain information in memory. Up until the point when you're presented with the probe and then have to compare the probe with the array that's maintained in memory, or resolve the competition that might have emerged in the period while you were maintaining that information. So this is the longest part of my talk, but I want to emphasize that much of that work highlighted how effects of attention are not unitary and only of one type, that they can differentiate when they operate on encoding and on maintenance. And then interestingly, there are developmental dissociations that emerge there. So attentional benefits on encoding, at least from 7, I'm sure, from 7 years of age, and I'm sure that will be very different from if we looked younger. Attentional effects on encoding, at least with that paradigm, were quite similar across children and adults, but not attentional effects during maintenance. I haven't shown you the MEG data, but I was so excited to hear about your pupillometry data, Zsuzsa, because we also see some really interesting state-like effects in the MEG signal at the encoding, at the point when children and adults encode information that predict on a trial-by-trial basis whether children and adults are going to remember or not. In these very simple paradigms. So altogether then, that leads to overall, and here I should correct myself, I should have removed that term, working memory maintenance in memory. And all of these ideas, the ideas that multiple factors influence maintenance in memory, are consistent with the classical view that attention is a gateway, that it has an effect on multiple stages that then lead to remembering. But in the remaining time, yes, I'm going to tell you about some of the more recent work that was originally, in fact, generated by Andrea again, that hints that what is held in memory, the nature of those representations, might also influence attention. And that, too, in attention research is a very exciting set of findings. So a hint of that, and one that I would love to hear replicated, it doesn't, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, Valerie, doesn't always replicate with verbal material and even with visual material. But a hint of the importance of the nature of the stimuli came again from Andrea's work, who in one of her experiments pitted against each other 2 types of memoranda, highly familiar, low age of acquisition, line drawings of animals, pitted against items that were not very easily nameable and non-familiar. And then she tested again, both memory with no cues and also memories with attentional cues during the maintenance period. So now I'm plotting Karen's cake, a capacity measure, not the capacity benefit that cues accrue. And that's because I wanted to point out that she replicated, even in this context, her basic finding that overall younger children are poorer at remembering 4 items than older individuals, and that cues across all age groups improve that memory. But interestingly, familiar items accrued bigger attentional benefits in this experiment than unfamiliar ones for all groups of participants, which told us that how well memoranda represented might matter to how well we orient our attention. And so that led to a whole set of other questions that we're still answering, I hope, but also to a change in paradigm, because we thought that all of our classic cueing paradigms weren't really getting at new encoding into memory and then the effects of those retrieval processes on attentional orienting. So we moved quite far away from cueing to natural scenes. Those, as an aside, were particularly relevant to Brianna, who led most of this work, because she was really interested in the effects of particular items within scene, social stimuli as opposed to non-social stimuli, and was really interested in understanding their perceptual characteristics and perceptual salience. And that diagram is there to remind me that Brianna was very interested in modeling low-level perceptual salience differences between social and non-social scenes to equate them. And then study how, as you learned that an object appeared in a social or non-social scene, that might guide your attention through the learning process. And using eye tracking, we could track that during learning. But also it might affect your memory of where that object might be in interesting ways, because you were asked to then locate that item within the scene. We've also followed this study up with EEG, and that is a really great potential, and I hope we can maybe discuss how that might apply to younger learners. But what she found in adults initially was that the nature of the scene, so the nature of what had been encoded, even though social distractors, social items were not relevant per se, they didn't really index where the target item that was entirely non-social would appear, that social distractors affected first looks during learning, and that memory precision was influenced also by the nature of the scenes. So for social scenes, memory precision was lower. She then went on to use that same paradigm with children, and again found some really interesting and even bigger effects of the social nature of the scenes on the learning phase. So what's plotted here over the 3 blocks when participants learnt is the proportion of trials when participants looked at the social distractors. And you can see the children are way higher than adults in that they really look at these social items a lot, especially to begin with. But interestingly, that effect of the social items, of the nature of the scenes, results in some really interesting precision, memory precision that's higher for children compared to adults. So that's what's plotted here. And on the y-axis is memory error. So a large score means you're not doing very well. Actually, that you're less precise in reporting where the item was. And the 2 sets of bars at the beginning, believe you me, are adults, not children. Normally you see that pattern of children doing more poorly than adults. In fact, we see greater precision in children compared to adults in this context. Both groups of individuals are affected by the social nature of the scenes, although that second finding is not something we replicate. But the greater memory precision in children is something we found now across another set of scenes. That's very interesting for us as attention researchers, because it tells us that certainly, yes, attention has an influence on memory, and we've in a way, built more evidence for a gateway kind of account for attention. But also that memory influences attentional guidance. There are familiarity effects that we need to pursue further, and really important roles of the characteristics of items in guiding attention. So we think these are really interesting effects to study in the context of changing systems, systems that have memory representations and information processing biases that may change, which is why I was really interested in hearing your work, Teresa, about initial biases that might shift, but maybe shifted through sometimes even short-term exposures prior to being tested. So moving to a preference to color is something that is possible with prior exposure. So it's very, very interesting. So gratuitous, in my last moment, I'm going to show you a picture of my children, because there's a reason for this, honest, because it allows me to close with something that my old mentor and supervisor said very famously to me, but to many others. Do not study children because you like them. You might very well like these ones, those are mine. But because they really give us the opportunity to study changes and interactions. And that's really borne true, at least for my work on attention and attentional interactions with memory. So a lot of the confusion and jump through depend on me, but thanks to all of these lovely people for the great ideas, if there are any there, they're theirs. And thank you for your attention. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments?
Also, I'm standing in the way of the drinks, so maybe. Any questions? Sure.
There's a question there.
Hi, Gaia. It's just a clarification question. So, in the study where children were better than adults, so they were less distracted.
Yeah.
What was the age?
Oh, so these are 6. Very great question. So it was a broad age range, this first study, 6 to 11. So quite old children, were very broad. Now we've replicated this study with a pretty large group of about 150 6 to 15-year-olds. So really interested in these age-related effects. I don't have the data plotted here. Yes, why was the question?
So, and this is this modulated by age? So the younger children are
yes,
better?
we think so. We couldn't ask that question here because the sample size was too small. But yes, we think there is modulation in the larger sample that we see by age.
Those, because I have the mic. Can you tell a little bit more about the social distractors?
Yeah,
because
that's
it's
right.
very difficult to see on your pictures. What kind of distractors were they?
Yeah, so they were big people, well, relatively big items of people standing in the scenes with neutral faces on them. And in fact, maybe you'll see that better in here. You see the tree up in the upper image up there. That's a non-social, equivalently sized, pretty salient non-social distractor. So all of our scenes were balanced to have something highly salient in them, but in the social scenes, the something salient was a person. Now we're very interested in, and we know from using a saliency algorithm that those scenes were equated in terms of low-level perceptual salience. And despite that, children, in fact even more than adults, looked at the social item within the scene more during learning. In fact, we think that might have played a placeholder effect, not a distraction effect for children. So we see overall, ultimately we see better memory for children compared to adults, whether the distractor was social or non-social. But even the term distractor might be a misnomer. In some individuals, and perhaps so the younger ones, the large salient item may be a placeholder. That's one interpretation of the benefit that we see in children. And the other is that perhaps what children do is explore more, explore the scene more. And in fact, they take longer to explore the scene. And that results in better and more established memories that then are more precise. So we're really asking these questions about the mechanisms of that benefit. But the benefit itself replicates now in our larger sample as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Since you prompted us, can you show us a little bit about the MEG results?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, please, thank you. So here we go. There were lots of extra slides. Here we go. So we went even simpler. This was a paradigm. We definitely didn't test babies. Sorry, 9 and I would love to work if people are interested in MEG, baby MEG work. We went very, very simple. There were no cues involved, 4 items, and then a probe. And then we asked questions about the temporal dynamics of accurate memory. So with MEG, in fact, like with fMRI, you can take the approach of plotting a regressor that's accuracy. So on a trial-by-trial basis, when are you being accurate compared to not? And that's what Duncan did. He identified a network of areas that were predictors of accurate memory. And in this paradigm, there were a right lateralized frontoparietal network. The particular frequency band we can talk about later. But what was interesting was that the predictive role of that network was at the point of encoding, around the encoding period. The state of that network when the array came up predicted accurate recall. And that was also pitted against some other potential regressor like load effects. Load did not behave in the same way as your state of that attentional network at encoding, which was very, very interesting. Not only that, the state of that network predicted activation in lower level visual cortices, which is plotted here. So there was a really interesting relationship between what that frontoparietal network was doing and what was going on in low level visual processing areas when the array was presented. So if the network was ready, visual cortex was also doing something that was setting the system up to do better, which is very interesting. So I'd love to do more of this work with people who work with younger children, because they were quite old, 9 to 11.